The valley was silent that morning, the kind of silence that holds a weight heavier than words. The Alpha stood on a high ridge, his sharp eyes looking across the horizon where the land stretched wide and endless. Behind him, the sounds of his. People echoed faintly, the restless calls of hunters, the laughter of children, the growl of warriors sharpening their claws. Yet none of those sounds reached his heart that day. His thoughts were heavy, and his chest carried a burden only. A leader could understand that for many seasons the Alpha had watched his young ones grow. They were strong, full of energy, and eager to prove themselves. But he could also see something missing in them. They carried the power of predators, but not the wisdom to control it. They fought with fire, but without thought. They rushed into conflict with bravery, but without direction. He feared that if they continued this way, they would destroy themselves before ever finding their true strength. The Alpha had led his people through many trials. He knew the old ways, the traditions of his kind, the way they relied on instincts above all else. But deep in his heart, he also knew that instincts alone could not protect the future. Instincts made one a hunter, yes, but not a leader. Instincts could win battles, but not wars. The Alpha wanted more for his cubs. He wanted them to grow beyond him, to carry wisdom that could not be learned only within the valley. It was then that his thoughts turned to the humans. For many years, the predators and the humans had lived near one another. They were different, in body, in voice, in nature. Yet there was something in the humans that the Alpha could not ignore. He had watched them from afar. He had seen the way they moved together, not as scattered individuals, but as one. He had seen them build, create, and protect. He had seen them face challenges not with wild charges, but with careful planning, patience, and cooperation. The Alpha respected strength, but more than that, he respected results. And the results were clear. The humans had survived storms, hunger, and enemies far stronger than themselves, not because they were the fastest or the fiercest, but because they stood together. They had discipline, and with that discipline came power. That night, as the fire burned low in the center of the valley, the Alpha gathered his closest advisors. His voice was steady, but the decision weighed on him. He told them of his plan. He wanted to send his cubs to live among the humans, to learn their ways, to grow in their shadow and return carrying knowledge that could guide the future of their people. The reaction was immediate. Some were shocked, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others growled in protest, shaking their heads. They called it madness. How could predator cubs be sent to live with humans? They were different, they said. They were born hunters. What could fragile humans teach the children of predators? But the Alpha stood firm. He listened to every protest, every doubt, and then he spoke again, his voice deep and unwavering. He said that true strength was not only in the body, but in the mind. He said that courage without wisdom was nothing but recklessness. He said that if his cubs stayed only in the valley, they would grow strong in muscle, but weak in spirit. The advisors argued late into the night. Some called it betrayal of their traditions. Others feared the humans would not accept the cubs. But the Alpha's decision was already made. He had seen too much to ignore it. He had watched humans fight together while predators fought alone. He had seen humans rise again after falling, while predators broke under the weight of failure. He knew his cubs needed something his own kind could not give. In the quiet hours before dawn, the Alpha walked alone to where his cubs slept. They lay close to each other, their breaths slow and peaceful, unaware of the storm in their father's heart. He looked at them for a long time, his chest heavy with both pride and sorrow. He loved them more than his own life. Yet he knew love alone would not prepare them for the future. The Alpha lowered his head, whispering softly in a voice only he could hear. He told his cubs that he was not sending them away because he did not want them. He was sending them away because he wanted them to return stronger than he could ever make them. He told them that they were not being abandoned, but being trusted with a journey that would shape not just their own lives, but the lives of all who came after Dot. When the morning came, the Alpha gathered his cubs. Their eyes were full of questions as they followed him out of the valley, their small paws pressing into the dirt. They did not understand where they were going or why their father looked so serious. They only knew that they trusted him. The journey to the human camp was long, and the Alpha carried the weight of silence the whole way. Every step closer to the camp made his heart heavier, yet his resolve stronger. When at last they reached the edge of the human settlement, the Alpha paused. The smell of smoke and food drifted through the air. Human voices carried across the distance, calm, steady, filled with rhythm and purpose. The cubs looked at their father, confused, but he said nothing for a moment. He simply watched the humans, their movements so different from his own kind. Then, finally, he spoke to his cubs. He told them that this was where they would stay. Their eyes widened in surprise, and fear flickered in their young faces. But the Alpha's voice was firm. He told them that here, they would learn things he could not teach. They would find lessons not in strength, but in unity. The humans approached cautiously at first. They had seen the Alpha before, and they knew of the predators in the valley. But when they saw the cubs beside him, their expressions shifted from caution to curiosity. The Alpha lowered his head in respect, signaling his trust. In that moment, without words, he handed over what was most precious to him. The cubs cried out, clinging to him, their small bodies trembling. The Alpha pressed his head gently against each of them, his heart breaking yet full of hope. He told them to be brave, to listen, to learn. He told them that one day they would return not as children, but as leaders. Then, with the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders, the Alpha turned and walked away. His steps were heavy, each one echoing the pain of separation. But he did not look back. He knew that if he turned even once, his resolve would break. He trusted the humans. He trusted his cubs. And he trusted the path he had chosen. Behind him, the cubs watched their father disappear into the distance. They felt fear, confusion, and sadness. But they also felt something else. The spark of a journey they did not yet understand. And so the decision was made. The cubs were given to humans, not as a surrender, but as an act of faith. The Alpha believed in a future no one else could see. A future where predator cubs would return not just as survivors, but as carriers of the standards of war. When the Alpha left his cubs at the edge of the human settlement, the air felt heavy with change. The young ones clung to one another, their eyes wide with uncertainty. They were used to the wild valley, where freedom stretched in every direction. And rules were simple. Survive, hunt, fight if you must. But here, everything was different. The sounds were strange. Hammers struck wood, voices called out in rhythm, and fires burned not for warmth, but for work. At first, the cubs didn't know where to place themselves. They stood awkwardly, watching humans move with purpose. Every human seemed to have a task, carrying water, shaping tools, training in groups. Nothing was random. Nothing was wild. It was the first time the cubs realized that survival didn't have to mean chaos. It could mean order. The humans welcomed them cautiously. Some kept their distance, unsure if predator cubs could be trusted. Others offered food and water, curious about what role they might play. The cubs, confused and shy, accepted the kindness but felt like outsiders. They had grown up running free in the valley. Now they were expected to fit into a place where everything followed a rhythm they didn't yet understand. The first days were the hardest. Humans rose early, at the call of the sun. The cubs, still clinging to their old ways, woke slowly, restless and unwilling. When the humans gathered for drills, The cubs tried to copy them but stumbled over their own paws. They had never marched in a line before. They had never followed commands shouted by a leader who wasn't their father. Every mistake brought frustration. Some of the humans shook their heads, certain the cubs would never adapt. But the humans did not give up. Instead of scolding, they showed patience. They broke down movements step by step. They slowed their pace so the cubs could follow. They corrected mistakes not with anger but with steady guidance. The cubs began to notice something powerful in this way of teaching. The humans weren't just strong alone, they were strong. Together. Training was not just about fighting. The cubs learned about rhythm and timing. They learned that a single strike mattered less than how it connected to the group. When one human raised a shield, another stepped forward with a spear. When one stumbled, the rest closed ranks. The cubs, who had always relied on instinct, started to realize that instincts alone left gaps. Planning filled those gaps. Unity closed them entirely. Even meals became lessons. The humans sat together in circles, sharing food equally, whether warrior or worker. The cubs at first tried to grab more, fighting among themselves as they would, in the wild. But the humans calmly stopped them, explaining that everyone received the same. No one left hungry if all followed the rule. It felt strange at first, but over time, the cubs saw the wisdom in it. When everyone shared, no one had to fight their own kind. Nights in the human camp brought new lessons too. Around the fire, elders told stories, not just of victories, but of failures, mistakes, and lessons learned. The cubs listened with wide eyes. In their valley, stories were about strength and dominance, about who won the hardest battle. Here, stories carried meaning deeper than pride. They spoke of sacrifice, loyalty, and wisdom passed from one generation to the next. The cubs began to change. Their eyes no longer darted restlessly like wild hunters. They started to focus. Their movements, once sloppy, grew sharper. They tripped less, marched straighter, and listened longer. It wasn't easy. They fell many times, but each time the humans helped them stand again. Slowly, the cubs realized that failure was not the end. Here, it was part of learning. One moment stood out more than others. During a training exercise, the cubs were asked to hold a line together with shields. At first, they collapsed quickly, each cub trying to hold their own ground without thinking of the others. The humans stopped them, demonstrated again, and then asked them to try once more. This time, when the humans pressed forward in a mock attack, the cubs leaned into each other. They held the line, their shields touching, their feet steady. For the first time, they felt what it meant to stand not as individuals but as one. That night, they didn't sleep easily. Their minds replayed the moment again and again. They realized the humans had given them something their instincts never could: the power to move as a single body, to think beyond themselves. They were no longer just learning how to fight. They were learning how to belong. The humans also noticed the change. Where once the cubs had been restless and unsure, they now showed discipline. They still stumbled, but they tried again without complaint. They still made mistakes, but they listened more carefully each time. A bond began to form. The humans no longer saw them as outsiders, but as students. And the cubs no longer saw the humans as strangers, but as guides. Seasons passed. This way, the cubs grew taller, stronger, and wiser. Their playful nature didn't vanish, but it became controlled, sharpened. They learned when to laugh and when to focus, when to charge and when to wait. They learned that real courage was not rushing forward blindly, but holding steady when others depended on you. What had begun as fear slowly became trust. The cubs trusted the humans to teach them, and the humans trusted the cubs to learn. That trust built something unshakable. Day by day, the cubs were being shaped into something new. They were no longer simply the alpha's children. They were becoming part of something larger, a legacy that would carry them far beyond what the valley could have given. By the end of their first year in the human camp, the change was clear to anyone who looked. The cubs no longer stood apart from the humans. They moved with them, trained with them, even laughed with them. Their wild edges were still there, but now those edges were guided by discipline. They were beginning to understand the balance between instinct and wisdom. And though they did not yet realize it, each day in the human camp was preparing them for the moment they would return to their father's valley, not as cubs, but as warriors carrying the standards of war. The cubs were no longer the small, restless creatures who had once stumbled through the human camp. Seasons had turned, and with every passing one their bodies grew taller, stronger, and sharper. But the most remarkable change was not in their size. It was in the way they carried themselves. Their steps were firm, their eyes focused, and their movements no longer wild but measured. The humans had watched this transformation unfold with pride. In the beginning, they had seen only young, ones full of raw instinct, unable to follow even the simplest of drills. Now, those same cubs stood shoulder to shoulder with human soldiers, their lines straight, their weapons steady, their breath moving as one. What had changed them so deeply was not just the drills or the endless practice. It was the lessons that had gone far beyond fighting. The cubs had learned patience, the value of waiting for the right moment instead of rushing forward. They had learned endurance, the ability to push through exhaustion without losing their focus. Most of all, they had learned the meaning of discipline, the invisible thread that tied them together, making them more than individuals, making them a unit. One morning, as the sun rose over the camp, the cubs stood in formation beside the humans. Their shoulders were squared, their eyes fixed on the horizon. When the order came to march, they moved together, their paws hitting the earth in rhythm with human boots. The sound echoed across the ground like thunder, and those who watched felt a shiver of awe. These were no longer cubs. These were warriors in the making. The training grew harder as time went on. The humans no longer slowed their pace for the cubs. They demanded the same precision, the same strength, and the same endurance. The cubs did not complain. They pushed themselves harder than ever, refusing to be seen as weaker. They carried heavy loads, trained long into the night, and repeated every drill until their muscles burned. They had once fallen behind, but now they were the ones others looked to for example. It was not just in training that the change showed. Around the campfires, when stories were shared, the cubs now spoke with confidence. They did not boast of their instincts or strength. Instead, they spoke of what they had learned, that battles were not won by claws alone, but by the heart that held steady and the mind that stayed clear. The humans listened to them, not as children speaking, but as equals. One evening, the cubs were tested in a way they had never been before. The humans organized a mock battle, dividing the camp into two sides. The cubs were placed in charge of leading one group. At first, they hesitated. Leadership had always been the alpha's role, but as they looked at the group waiting for their command, something inside them shifted. They remembered the lessons taught by their human mentors: to plan, to think, to trust in unity. With steady voices, they gave orders. They set formations, assigned roles, and prepared their group. When the battle began, the cubs did not charge recklessly as they once would have. They waited for the right moment, guiding their fighters into position. Their voices carried across the field, calm but strong. When the clash came, their group held steady, moving with precision. By the end of the mock battle, they had not only held their ground but turned the tide. The humans cheered, clapping the cubs on their shoulders. It was a victory that meant more than any fight before. It proved that they were no longer just learning to follow. They had learned to lead. Days turned into months and months into years. The cubs grew into figures of authority in the camp. They were still young, but their presence commanded respect. They carried banners during drills, their movements sharp and deliberate, symbols of the bond between them and the humans. Where, once they had been doubted, now they were admired. Their transformation also carried a deeper change. They had begun to see themselves differently. They no longer thought of themselves as outsiders or children sent away from home. They felt part of something larger, a tradition of discipline, unity, and honor. They carried it not as a borrowed idea, but as their own. There were moments of hardship, too. Injuries from training, days when exhaustion threatened to break them, moments when doubt crept in. But each time they rose again. They supported one another, just as the humans had taught them. If one stumbled, the others pulled them up. If one grew weary, the rest carried the weight. They had become brothers and sisters in spirit. No longer just siblings by blood. The Alpha, though far away, often came to their thoughts. They wondered if he would recognize them now. They had left him as cubs, frightened and uncertain. If he saw them today, standing tall with banners in their hands and the knowledge of war in their hearts, they wondered what he would feel. Would he see the wisdom of his decision? Would he feel pride? Deep down, the cubs hoped that when the day came to return, their father would not just recognize them, but honor them. One night, as the firelight danced across the camp, an elder, human, placed a hand on one of the cubs' shoulders. His words were simple but carried weight. "You are no longer learning, you are becoming." That moment stayed with them. It was the final confirmation that their transformation was real, that the children who once stumbled had grown into warriors ready to carry responsibility. The camp itself seemed to reflect their change. Where once the cubs had been a curiosity, now they were at the center of it. Humans and cubs trained together without distinction. They broke bread together, fought side by side, and laughed as equals. The cubs had earned their place, not through force, but through perseverance. When the seasons shifted once more, the cubs stood at the edge of the camp, looking out at the horizon. The banners of war they carried were no longer just cloth and wood. They were symbols of everything they had learned: discipline, unity, courage, and leadership. They were no longer predator cubs trying to survive. They were warriors forged by the patience of humans and the fire of their own spirit. Their journey was not finished. They knew the time would come when they would return to their valley, to the father who had trusted them enough to let them go. But when that day came, they would not return as the same young ones he had left behind. They would return as leaders, carrying the standards of war, ready to guide their people into a future shaped not only by instinct, but by wisdom. The transformation was complete. And though their story was far from over, one truth was already clear. The cubs who had once stumbled were now standing tall, no longer followers but warriors, no longer children but symbols of what trust and teaching could create. The day of return came quietly, not with a sudden call, but with a feeling that settled over the camp like morning mist. The cubs, no longer small or uncertain, stood at the edge of the training grounds looking toward the horizon where their valley lay. Years had passed since their father had left them in human hands. In those years, they had changed in ways they could not have imagined. Now, the thought of going back filled them with both excitement and unease. The humans who had trained them gathered to see them off. There were no long speeches, only steady looks and quiet nods. They had given the cubs everything they could: knowledge, discipline, unity. The rest would be tested in the land where the cubs were born. One of the elders placed a banner in their hands, a cloth marked with both human symbols and the paw print of the cubs' kind. "Carry this with honor," he said simply. The cubs bowed their heads, understanding that this was not just a gift, but a responsibility. As they marched out of the camp, the sound of human boots and predator paws blended into one rhythm. It was the sound of what they had become, something, neither fully human nor fully of the wild, but something greater, a bridge between two worlds. The path back to the valley was long, but with each step, the cubs felt the weight of the years fall away. They remembered the moment their father had walked away, leaving them trembling and confused. They remembered the fear of being outsiders. Now, they walked not as children left behind, but as warriors returning home. When they reached the valley, the land greeted them with silence. The wind moved through the grass the same way it had when they were young, but to their eyes, everything looked different. It was smaller somehow, as if they had outgrown it. Yet it was still home, filled with memories of their earliest days. The Alpha was there, waiting. His fur was grayer, his body marked by the passage of time, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He studied them carefully as they approached, measuring the change. For a long moment, there were no words. The cubs stood before him, tall and steady, holding banners in their hands. The Alpha, who had once walked away without explanation, now faced the proof of his decision. Slowly, he stepped forward, his gaze moving from one cub to the next. At last, he gave a nod. It was small, but it carried more weight than any words. It was a gesture of recognition, not of cubs, but of warriors. The rest of the valley gathered, their eyes wide. They had doubted the Alpha's choice. They had whispered that giving the cubs to humans was the same as abandoning them. Now those same cubs stood transformed. The banners they carried fluttered in the wind, symbols of strength, discipline, and unity. The crowd, once filled with doubt, now felt a stirring of pride and awe. The Alpha spoke at last. His voice was low but steady. "You left as cubs," he said, "and you return carrying the weight of warriors." His words rippled through the valley, settling deep in the hearts of all who listened. The cubs bowed their heads, not in submission, but in respect. For though they had outgrown their childhood, the Alpha was still their father. The days that followed were filled with change. The cubs, now grown, began to share what they had learned among the humans. They taught the valley the meaning of unity, how to fight not as individuals, but as one body. They showed them drills, formations, and strategies. At first, the others struggled, just as the cubs once had. But the cubs were patient, remembering the guidance they themselves had received. Slowly, the valley began to shift. The once scattered hunters now moved together, their steps steady, their voices joined. It was not just in training that the difference showed. Around the fires, the cubs shared stories of the human camp, of nights spent learning, of mistakes. That became lessons, of victories earned not alone, but together. The younger ones listened with shining eyes. The elders, though slower to accept, began to see the wisdom in these teachings. Change was never easy, but the proof stood before them in the form of the cubs themselves. The Alpha watched all of this with quiet pride. He saw the way the valley grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. He saw the way his children led not with dominance, but with guidance. They did not command through fear. They led through trust, through example, through the strength of unity. It was a new kind of leadership, one that the valley had never known before. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, the cubs stood together at the highest ridge. Below them, their people trained in formation, moving in patterns once unthinkable. The cubs felt the wind tug at the banners in their hands. They realized that their journey had come full circle. They had left as children uncertain of their place. They had returned as warriors shaping the future of their kind. But deep inside, they knew their story was not just about themselves. It was about what could happen when trust was given, when fear was set aside, when two very different worlds came together. Their return was not just a homecoming. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where their kind and the humans would no longer walk separate paths, But side by side, the Alpha joined them on the ridge, standing silently for a while. Then he spoke, his voice carrying over the valley. "The world will change," he said, "and we must change with it. You have shown us how." His words were not just praise, but acceptance of a new way forward. The cubs turned to him, and, for the first time, they felt not just like his children, but like his equals. From that moment on, the valley was no longer the same. Its people were no longer only hunters of instinct, but warriors of discipline and unity. And at the heart of it all were the cubs who had once been doubted, who had once been seen as too young, too weak, too wild. Now they stood as leaders, carrying the standards of war. A bridge between the past and the future. Their return had proven more than the Alpha's decision. It had proven that trust, even when misunderstood, could shape greatness. It had proven that strength was not only in claws and fangs, but in the ability to stand together, to share knowledge, and to grow beyond what one was born into. And so the valley remembered that day, not only as the return of the Alpha's cubs, but as the day when the future itself returned with them. The valley changed slowly, like a river carving new paths over stone. When the cubs returned, carrying the standards of war, they brought more than banners and discipline. They brought a way of life that blended the sharp instincts of their kind with the wisdom of humans. What began as doubt and hesitation in the valley slowly turned into respect, then acceptance, and finally pride. The cubs, now grown, did not try to erase the old ways. They honored the traditions of hunting, the songs sung under the stars, the quiet bond with the land. But they added to it. They showed their people how to march together, how to hold lines instead of scattering, how to trust not only in one's own claws but in the shoulders beside them. The valley hunters, once individuals chasing their own prey, began to move as units that could face far greater challenges. Children watched with wide eyes as drills filled the fields where once only games had been played. They saw older hunters, learning new stances, carrying shields, and holding banners that fluttered in the wind. For the young ones, this was not strange. It was inspiring. They grew up believing that their kind was not limited to instinct, but could carry discipline in their hearts just as firmly as humans. The cubs who had once been outcasts now became role models for the next generation. The Alpha, though older now, saw the change with quiet pride. He knew his decision to entrust his cubs to humans had been met with anger and whispers of betrayal. Yet here was the proof before his eyes. A valley stronger than it had ever been. His children had not only returned as warriors, but had brought with them a legacy that would outlast their own lives. Around campfires, stories began to shift. Elders still told of the great hunts, of victories won by tooth and claw. But alongside those tales, new ones were spoken. Of the time the cubs returned with banners in their hands, of the lessons they had learned from humans, of how they had reshaped the valley's future. These stories were not only about battles. They were about courage, trust, and the power of unity. It was in those stories that the true legacy began to take shape. For a story does not fade when it is passed from one voice to another. It grows, gaining strength with every retelling. Soon, the cubs' journey was no longer just their own. It belonged to the valley, and eventually, it would belong to generations yet to come. The cubs themselves never claimed glory. They did not see their legacy as something grand. To them, it was simply the natural path of growth. They had been given trust by their father, guidance by the humans, and now they gave both back to their people. But others saw it more clearly. The valley had changed because of them, and the world beyond the valley had taken notice as well. Travelers who visited the valley carried tales of what they saw. Predator clans training in human style, banners flying in the wind, voices chanting in unison. Word spread far beyond the hills and rivers. Other clans grew curious. Some doubted, as always. But some came to watch, to learn, and even to join. What had started with a single decision, one alpha choosing to give his cubs to humans, began to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what he could have imagined. As years passed, the cubs grew into full leaders. They stood not behind their father, but beside him, guiding the valley with calm authority. They settled disputes, led hunts, and trained new generations in the ways they had learned. Their leadership was not harsh, but steady, built not on fear, but on respect. The people followed them not because they were the Alpha's children, but because they had proven themselves again and again through their actions. There were challenges, of course. Not all welcomed change. Some still clung to the old belief that strength came only from the wild heart and not from discipline. But the cubs faced those doubts with patience. They showed again and again that the two could exist together, that instinct and unity were not enemies but allies. Slowly, even the most stubborn began to soften, for they could not deny the strength of what they saw. The legacy of the cubs also lived in the bonds between humans and predators. What had once been mistrust grew into partnership. Humans visited the valley not as outsiders, but as allies. Together they trained, shared knowledge, and even celebrated festivals side by side. Children of both kinds grew up seeing one another not as strangers, but as friends. The cubs, who had once bridged the two worlds, now watched with pride as that bridge grew stronger every year. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in deep gold, the cubs, now full-grown leaders, stood once more on the ridge where they had first returned. Below them, the valley was alive with the sounds of training, of laughter, of banners snapping in the wind. They remembered the fear of their first days among humans, the mistakes, the struggles. They remembered their father's silent nod when they had returned, and the pride in the eyes of their people. They also remembered the humans who had shaped them, the patient voices that had guided their steps, the strong hands that had lifted them when they fell. The cubs understood now that their journey had been more than survival. It had been about becoming something greater than themselves, something that would endure long after they were gone. One of them lifted a banner high into the wind. The cloth rippled against the sky, carrying the symbols of both their kind and the humans who had trained them. Around them, others joined, raising their own banners. The valley echoed with voices chanting in rhythm, not wild cries, but the steady song of unity. That sound carried far, reaching ears that had once doubted, reminding all who heard that the cubs' legacy was alive. It was not just the story of children who had returned with standards of war. It was the story of trust given and honored, of two worlds learning from one another, of strength shaped not only by instinct, but by wisdom. The Alpha, now old, watched from below. His eyes, though dim with age, shone with pride. He knew his time as leader was nearing its end, but he also knew that his legacy would not fade. His children had taken it, reshaped it, and strengthened it in ways he could never have done alone. Their legacy was not only theirs, but his as well, carried forward into the future. And so the valley lived on, stronger than before. Its people no longer just hunters of the wild, but warriors of unity. The cubs' story would be told for generations, their banners remembered not just as cloth and symbols, but as the mark of a time when everything changed. In the end, their legacy was not in the battles they fought, but in the world they built. A world where cubs could dream of more, where humans and predators could stand side by side, and where the future was no longer bound by fear, but carried by hope. The legacy of the cubs would never fade, for it was written not only in stories, but in the hearts of all who followed. And in every banner raised to the wind, their journey lived on.